Okay, this is where we left off. Genetics of genes on the 6 chromosomes is continuation. Instead of color blindness, it's hemophilia. It's also a recessive X-linked trait. We'll go through this. If a carrier female marries an unaffected male, what fraction of their sons will be affected? So first of all, the female, if she's a carrier, how many X's with the mutation for hemophilia does she have? 1 X or 2 X's? 1 X. Okay. Now, let's do this. Okay. Up on top is a male that's unaffected. So he's X and he's also Y. Okay. And then the female is XX, right? So she's got 1 normal X and then she's got 1 bad X. So we just go across as we did before. Here we have X, 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 Y, X, X, and X, Y. So what fraction of their sons, not children, but what fraction of their sons will be affected? Well, the only sons are on this side, right? So 50%. 50% normal, and then 50% hemophilia. Okay. Red-green colorblindness is caused by a recessive X-linked allele. If you're a colorblind male, which parent gave you colorblindness? Okay. Well, if you're a male, what determines gender? Or what determines gender, period? An X or a Y? It's always the Y chromosome, right? Okay, so if you have 1 Y, that means, where did the X come from? The X came from your mother. Okay, so this is an XY, and she had a defective allele. She's heterozygous. She's not colorblind, but she's a carrier. So, which parent gave you colorblindness? If it's an X-linked allele, it's always going to be your mother. Okay, qualitative versus quantitative traits. So, a qualitative trait usually involves 2 alleles for 1 locus. So, for example, if we had purple or white flowers, 1 allele we'll call P, and the other we'll call W. Okay? And then, if we're homozygous purple, then it's P, P. Heterozygote, it'll be PW. And homozygous W, white, white. If purple is in fact dominant, then PP or PW will both show purple flowers, and only WW will show white. Cystic fibrosis. or not cystic fibrosis is the same sort of thing. Okay, so there's the normal allele, and we'll call that cystic fibrosis CN, and then CF is cystic fibrosis, and then we'll have a number of, so we'll have CN, we'll have CN, CF, and we'll have CF. Okay? If normal is dominant, then either CN or CNCF are normal. That means they don't have cystic fibrosis. It's a recessive deleterious allele, so CFCF is the, unfortunately, the one who gets the disease. And they have very low fitness. Okay. Now, then there are also what are called quantitative traits. Quantitative traits show continuous variation within the population. In other words, height. So if height was just qualitative, we'd say, and we had two alleles, we'd say short or tall, right? But it's not that. There are quantitative traits, actually, for height. There's a whole bunch of different genes, each with different alleles. And each gene contributes only a small effect to height, but if you add them all up, you get a situation where you get continuous height from, let's say, 4'8", which will be on the low end, short end, all the way up to, let's see, 7 feet tall. Okay? And same thing with skin color. It's also a quantitative trait with many genes. We have gradations of white all the way to very, very dark brown. Same thing with cholesterol levels or musical ability. Shows continuous variation, and what I mean by that is so here's a mean. It's the average, right? Let's say it's the average height, and then you have everybody from, we'll say, over here, 4 feet, up to 7 feet, right? Okay, so that's how that works. Okay, and then this is what I just showed. 5'8" is the mean. Now, just so you know, height, there's actually differences between males and females. So if you put all the males and females together, you would see something exactly like this, right? And actually, most of the women would be down here, and most of the men, be some overlap here, would be over here. Okay? In other words, there would be two means. One for the woman, who's, let's say, 5'5", and one for the men, who's, let's say, 5'10". Okay? So if we would actually look at this in terms of actual height, we have women Women are generally shorter. Okay. The average height for women is, let's say, 5'2". Okay. Down here is 4 feet tall, and up here is 7 feet tall. And then at the same time we would also have another distribution. Here's the mean, and this would actually be about 5'10". Okay, and again, there are a large number of genes, each with a very small effect, and when you combine them, you get this variation that's continuous instead of like short and tall, period, or short, medium, and tall. It's never like that. It can be anything along these distributions. Traits that are controlled by a single gene are monogenic. Traits that are under the influence of many genes are called okay. Which is more likely to show continuous variation, a monogenic or a polygenic trait? You should know this. So monogenic, no. Polygenic, yes. Because we just showed with height, polygenic, and it showed continuous variation. Okay. So here is another example of a polygenic trait. Okay. So why are some traits quantitative? Well, that means each gives a small effect. Now, it turns out eye color is polygenic. There are actually 3 genes for the 3 colors, blue, green, and yellow. Is that right? Or red, I forget. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Okay, and our cones have 3 different pigment types, each with a separate gene. Okay, now the thing is, when you combine all 3, you can get a wide range of eye colors. Okay, so just like this. This guy right here, this is old Blue Eyes, Paul Newman. He was a heartthrob. He had these deep, you can see, these deep blue eyes. Women fell all over the place for him. And then, but if we actually look at different eye colors, we have dark brown to light brown, right, to amber and green, aqua, and blue. Okay? So this whole range of color just from those 3 genes, and of course the promoter region determines how much of each gene is actually expressed. So that's how you get more and more greater variation, including putting these genes all together. Okay. Okay, when I talked about this earlier, I said, okay, look at these are quantitative traits or the same thing with qualitative traits, but there's usually a gene by environment interaction. Okay, so not only do different alleles have different effects in different environments. For example, normal hemoglobin has the highest fitness when there's no malaria. The heterozygote with one normal and one sickle cell allele has the highest fitness where there is malaria, but it has less fitness than the normal where there's no malaria, because there's still a loss of oxygen carrying capacity and some sickling that can cause disease. Okay, so that's one thing, but in terms of how genes are expressed can also affect phenotype. So I'm going to give you an example. There is a marine snail. This is one of the first things that was ever really shown on this. And there was a predator for them, which were starfish. Okay, and there were some locations where there was a marine snail and there were no starfish, and other locations where there were starfish. And the marine snails look different. When there's no starfish, you had this nice periwinkle sort of shape that we did earlier with the snails and green crabs. Whereas when there were crabs, when there is starfish present, all the snails have much thicker shells and much more thicker swirls, and they look quite different. And in fact, they used to be thought of as different species. But it turns out that when these snails, when there's fertilized eggs and they settle down, if there are starfish in the environment, they release chemicals, and the little tiny eggs and larvae pick up on these chemicals from the starfish, and that causes the shells to develop into a very thick shell to prevent the starfish from being able to eat them. However, when there's no starfish around, the chemical is absent, and so whether there's a chemical or not expresses different genes in terms of how the shell actually develops. And so you have these different shell types. They're actually the same species and the same genes, but it depends on the chemical cue that either is or is not in the environment at certain concentrations. And it turns out that when there's no starfish, normal shells that aren't necessarily very thick, those animals, if you put them together with the thick-shelled ones, will outcompete. But if you put the two together in an environment with a starfish, then the thicker-shelled ones will survive and the other ones will get eaten. So the same sort of thing that's going on. Okay, so genes are necessary but not sufficient. Traits can be controlled by genes and highly influenced by the environment. Okay, so as we see, we've got pigment genes, and of course here we have a child with very light skin on the left and her friend with the very dark skin on the right. Okay, so there's differences in the alleles that result in skin color. First of all, there's more melanin in the African American child compared to the lighter skinned European American child. Okay? But at the same time, when you put these children out in the sun, there's still enough pigment to turn the whiter child's skin a little darker, and so she gets a tan. It turns out even African Americans can show darker skin if they're out in the sunlight a lot. So it depends on, again, the environment and how these genes are actually expressed, and they can show a wide range of, in this case, shades of skin. Okay. Now, if you remember, when we did Darwinian snails, part of it had to do with what do you need? You need variation for selection to work on, and you need heritable. It has to be heritable variation. Otherwise, if you don't have variation, there's no genetic diversity, and it won't matter whether it's selection. There'll be no variation on which certain individuals survive better than others. The same thing with heritability. You can have variation, and some variants might, let's say, survive better than others, but if that trait is not heritable, then it still won't matter, because in the future generations, whether you have, let's say, a thick shell, or a medium thick shell, or a thin shell, if that is not heritable trait, then let's say your parents had thick shells, but you might as well you might end up have thin shells, so there's no heritability there. Okay, so it turns out skin color is heritable, height is heritable. In fact, height is about 80 or 90% heritable, and same with skin color. So measure of relative importance of genes determining a trait under a certain set of conditions in a given environment. Okay. Now, we can get a better idea of heritability. Well, first of all, we can sequence things nowadays, but in the past, we could actually, if we looked at identical twins compared to fraternal twins, or dizygotic versus monozygotic, you can, in one case, you would expect identical twins, they have the same genes, and they share the same maternal environment in terms of of being in the womb. There might be a slight difference depending on if they're sharing the same placenta or different placentas, but they're still identical genes. Once they're born, they're going to start to come into contact with, let's say, different environmental factors. So I might have, let's say, told you about the story about pirates. I don't remember if I did, but anyway, I'll go through it real quickly. There was a family, and they had identical twins. And they were from Nebraska. There was Sean and John were the two twins. And they were the first kids that this couple had. And the grandparents were so excited that they bought the whole family, not them, to go a round trip around the world on a cruise that was going to take 2 months. Okay, so the twins were about a year old. They get on a ship in Miami. They go to Jamaica. A few mishaps, you know. They go to Jamaica. When they're on the island, they get robbed by a bunch of Rastafarian panheads, and but nothing really happens. And then they hit some storms, and even though all the food there is great, it's not so good. And so by the time they head across the Atlantic, they're starting to wonder whether, cruising is actually for them. Anyway, the ship goes all the way down south around Cape Horn, which is the tip of Africa, and up on the eastern side. And they're going to then continue eventually over to India. But when they get off of the Somali coast in the Gulf of Aden, lo and behold, the ship is stormed by pirates. And these aren't the kind of pirates that you saw in old movies. These are pirates with AK-47s and rocket-propelled grenades and all that. And before the pirates get there, the kids and the parents are playing in the pool, right? And everybody's happy. But then Sean gets a little cranky, and so Mom takes him upstairs to their room for a nap, while John still wants to keep playing, and he plays with Dad. An hour later, the pirates show up. At this point, Mom and the baby are asleep. They don't really hear, even though there's hello. And the pirates board the ship, and the father is the baby's floating in the pool with a life jacket on, and the dad has gotten out, and there's these pirates, and he goes to save his kid, and the pirates shoot him dead, so he's dead. And then the pirates take all the kids and then eventually sell them into slavery in Africa, in Chad, where there's still slavery. And eventually, so it turns out that the baby that was asleep and her mother, the mom doesn't tell the kid eventually when he grows up what happened. It's just one of those terrible things. The kid has a slight maybe memory, but not really, of his twin brother. His twin brother, in the meantime, is now a slave in Africa. You can imagine the difference in the food environment. In Nebraska, the kid has all the food he needs. He grows into a 6'4" individual, like linebacker, is going to play for the University of Nebraska. And the other twin only grows to, let's say, 5'10". Height is heritable. They have the same genes, but the environment is different in terms of food. And he's also quite a bit skinnier. Well, instead of joining, playing football, the brother decides to join the Marines. They transfer him to Chad or Niger. And lo and behold, in one village, they come across these slaves. And there's one that looks surprisingly like himself. Well, to make a long story short, it's actually his long-lost brother. They do a DNA test. The brother and his brother actually, the slave brother actually has a wife. And they both, they come back to America with the twin who grew up in America. Everything is great, except that, of course, they're different sizes because of the food environment. And then in the United States, a famine hits. We haven't had a famine here in ages, but a famine hits. Which individual is actually going to survive better? The one that's smaller, who needs less food. So he survives. The big brother, who's identical to him, doesn't. Now, when you get the same genes, but different expression patterns, that's called phenotypic plasticity. And so in this case, food environment is the trigger in terms of how much growth there is. Okay. Oh, by the way, if the large son and the family, they don't have any kids that survive, he doesn't survive. But his brother, who's identical to him, does survive and has 4 kids. What's the fitness, relative fitness, for the one who didn't survive? It's the same as the brother who did survive. Okay. Anyway, so twin studies, obviously, identical twins have the same exact genes. The only difference they have will be in, let's say, environments, and usually all the way up through until adulthood, they're sharing similar environments. After that, they might diverge, or they might stick around with each other because they just feel comfortable, whatever. And they usually end up looking similar, being the same size, talking similar. Not always, though. But like if you put them in different environments, you can certainly get some very different characteristics. And if you look down here, Jack and twin and Oscar, identical twins separated shortly after birth. Jack grew up in Trinidad and the United States with his Jewish father, whereas Oscar grew up as a Nazi in Germany with his Catholic mother. And you can go to this video. It's also on Canvas. And one, of course, was an anti-Semitic Jew-hater, Jew-hating Nazi, and the other was a Jew, even though the Jew-hating Nazi was, in fact, half Jewish. So they shared many traits in common. Of course, they had different viewpoints. They later became, they found out about each other. It was difficult, especially, well, for both of them. But eventually, they met each other. They had, it was, you'll see. Anyway, go ahead and look at it. So, how do genes matter? For quantitative traits, it's difficult to predict the phenotype of children from the phenotypes of parents. Okay? Especially since when I talked earlier about, traits skipping a generation in terms of dominant and recessive, it depends on which the genes or alleles on which chromosome are expressed more compared to the other chromosome that they got from the individual's other parent. Okay, so that's one. Genes can have a strong influence on even complex behavioral traits, just as much as they can on anatomy and physiology and development, all that kind of stuff. And environment can have large effects even on traits under genetic control. In other words, even on alleles that are exactly the same, they're identical, but the environment can result in different phenotypes as well. And that's all there is to it.